All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Learning from Fear, the conference. Very excited that we're all here and able to uh, participate, learn a little bit more. We have two in-person panelists for this group, and then we'll have one virtual panelist with us as well. Yeah, should be good. Nice and low key. The Panera Bread will be out there all day. So let me get this PowerPoint and we can get the ball rolling. You want to drive?
All right. I'll. Okay. You don't scare me. And don't come back until I say so. These were the last words of my favorite picture book as a little girl, Go Away, Big Green Monster by Ed Imberly. I enjoyed telling the monster to go away while reading with my mother before bed. Instead of being scared by the monster, I was taught to stand up to him and boss him around. Several years later, I read Der Struwwelpeter here, a 19th century German children's book by Dr. Heinrich Hoffmann, which had children suffer horrific fates such as having a tailor cut off their thumbs for sucking them, burning alive after playing with matches, and starving to death after refusing to eat soup. Der Struwwelpeter's message was clear: don't misbehave or bad things will happen to you. As I thought of both of these books, I wondered what caused picture books to change from terrifying children with tales of horrific fates for misbehavior to encouraging children to face their fears and monsters. As I thought of this topic more, I remembered Dr. Seuss's Bartholomew and the Oobleck, which had elements of both these stories. Like Der Struwwelpeter, it had characters face a horrific consequence for bad behavior. However, instead of Bartholomew to be the one to either learn to rely on adult authority or learn a lesson, it is the king who learns from his bad behavior. While earlier picture books controlled children through fear, modern picture books instead encourage children to face their fears to prepare them for adulthood. Oh, I mean, whoops, there we go. While there have been several English translations of Der Struwwelpeter, I use the English Struwwelpeter or Pretty Stories and Funny Pictures for my analysis. The title of this translation seems deeply ironic. Instead of happy fairy tales where good children get rewarded, this collection seems to be an example of the cautionary tales genre, which are tales that have naughty or immoral characters punished in cruel ways to promote docility and parental obedience. While some characters only suffer embarrassments, such as the story of Fidgety Philip, right here, other stories in this collection have characters face mutilation or even death, such as the story of Lil Suckathumb, which is about a little boy who has his thumbs cut off by the great tall tailor after ignoring his mother's warning against sucking his thumb. These grisly fates are especially shocking when you can. Oh, whoops. These these grisly fates are especially shocking when you consider that Der Struwwelpeter was often given as Christmas presents to young children. The opening of the English Struwwelpeter here, actually, right here, even promises the reader that good children will get several Christmas presents, while bad children shall never look at this pretty picture book. Of course, it was not uncommon for children to be threatened with violence as punishment in 19th century children's books. After all, throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, children as young as 2 were caned for minor offenses such as dirtying a frock, not being able to spell a word, and disobeying. This, this, Then Parrott discusses how some view Dr. Struwwelpeter as a book where the illustrations and stories are solely meant to terrify the child reader into accepting the moralistic lessons of the text. Due to the grisly fates of misbehaving children, it's easy to understand why modern adults would be horrified that young children read this. However, many scholars have argued that instead of only frightening children, Der Struwwelpeter was instead meant to simultaneously scare and amuse young readers due to the unrealistic and exaggerated nature of the fates of the naughty children and the almost cartoonish illustrations. Ben Parrott explains that while readers of Strulapir were often disgusted or horrified by the illustrations, they also find humor and delight in the laughably depicted punishment scenarios. Emily Pierman also argues that instead of being part of the cautionary tales genre, Strulapir was actually part of the cautionary verse genre, which she defines as a humorous send-up of such seriously meant cautionary tales. In contrast to the more serious cautionary tales, cautionary verse is meant to both amuse and frighten children as a form of education. A good example of this is the story of Augustus who would not have any soup, where Augustus refuses to eat soup until he dies of starvation over the course of 5 days. While normally this would be horrifying and tragic, the unrealistic illustrations of Augustus progressively wasting away to the point of being a stick figure, and the descriptions such as, he scarcely wastes more than a sugar plum, makes the story so ridiculous that it becomes darkly comedic. As a cautionary verse book, Strulapir balances horror and comedy in order to teach and humor young children. While Strulapir and the cautionary verse genre is played for dark comedy, is still part of a long tradition of using fear to control children and encourage them to listen to and rely on adult figures such as their parents for their own safety. Jackie Stalcup compares earlier cautionary tales and first with more modern books such as Ghost Hours, Spooks Hours. While their approaches are different, both books encourage children to rely on their parents for safety and security. Spearman also describes how cautionary verse stories often have adult figures who are unwilling or unable to protect them from harm as a result of that child's bad behavior. For example, in the dreadful story of Harriet's and the Patches, Harriet, who is also known as Pauline or Pauline in other editions, plays with matches while her mother and nurse are away despite their warnings. Harriet explains that readers of Strulapir are not given a reason for each child's bad behavior because the reader already knows the reason. Mischief is fun. However, Harriet's motives are deeper than mere mischief. Harriet is drawn to the matches not only because they're forbidden, but Mama too often does the same. They represent something she, as a child, is denied, being grown up and doing things herself. This is explicitly shown when she drops her doll in the illustration of to play with the matches, even as her cats hiss and tell her, "Burn to death if you do so." In her mother and nurse's absence, the cats become Harriet's authority figures who try to protect her from herself. However, Harriet ignores their advice, and when she catches on fire, the cats cannot save her. They can only scream for help and later weep over her ashes and red shoes as they cry, make haste, meow, meow, she'll burn to death, we told her so. As a result of Harriet's desire to be an adult and play with dangerous, forbidden things, she will never grow to an adult, and the authority figures who loved her were powerless to save her. Strulapir's ultimate message is this: be good and depend on your parents, or they won't be able to keep you safe. In contrast to Der Strulapir, which used fear to control children, Emberley's Go Away Big Green Monster encourages children to embrace their mischievous and independent side and resist their fear of monsters. Monsters and boogeymen have haunted children for eons, with Marcia Barrett Lippincott noting that both Plato and Locke encouraged mothers not to frighten their children with stories of boogeymen in order to control them. For the first half of the picture book, the story appears to be a terrifying tale of a monster, beginning with a black page with two yellow eyes peering at the reader as the book ominously begins with, a green monster has two yellow eyes. The story continues as the monster grows features such as a red mouth with sharp white teeth and scraggly purple hair before finally forming a big scary face. But this is not a spooky story about a monster to scare the reader into being good. Instead, when the child turns the page, they are invited to shout, "You don't scare me, so go away, scraggly purple hair." The reader continues to turn Turn the pages, making each part of the monster go away one by one until there is nothing left. But finally, the reader tells the monster, and don't come back until I say so. Feel free to pass around the book, by the way, and read through it. This book has been praised by critics for how the die-cut pages allow the reader to construct and deconstruct the big green monster to teach children to take control over their own monsters. However, Stallcap critiques this book by arguing that while it acts as an escape from adult authority by giving children control of the monster, it is not empowering because it does not force or even encourage the child to reject the ultimately subordinate role of a child at play and act like an adult. However, I argue that the story is empowering for the child because it helps parents teach their children to face their fears and become more independent as they grow. Stallcup claims that adults are entirely absent from the text. There is no one besides the monster and the reader. However, this is not necessarily true for young children. Before I was old enough to read on my own, my mother read this book to me, turned the pages, showed me how the monster appears and disappears, and yelled out the words with me. Later, when I was old enough to read it on my own, I was able to make the monster disappear by himself. Just as picture books are a child's first step to literacy, reading this book with their parents could be a child's first step to learning how to face their own fears and problems alone. The monster may frighten children at first, but once the child knows how to make the monster disappear and reappear, they no longer need their parents to control the monsters for them. They can control the monsters themselves. Unlike the monsters or forces of punishment in Strollapere, the monster in Go Away Big Green Monster does nothing but is always being done too.
5 minutes.
Parents reading this book to children not only teach them how to control their fears, but also teach them to develop independence and face their fears and problems through the harmless big green monster. However, what happens when the monster is not harmless? Okay. Unlike Go Away Big Green Monster, the Oobleck in Bartholomew and the Oobleck is a serious threat that not only threatens the misbehaving character, but an entire kingdom. This book shares several aspects of this tradition of the cautionary tale. However, instead of the naughty character being a child, the naughty character is an adult, specifically a king. King Derwin of Did, as an adult and one with great authority, seems like a strange choice to be the naughty child figure. On the surface, it would make more sense for his nephew, Grand Duke Wilfred, the antagonist of the 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cummins, to be the naughty child figure punished by the Oobleck. However, Philip Nell argued that this change was influenced by Dr. Seuss's experience in World War II. In the 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cummins, which was published before World War II, King Derwin was more of a passive, flawed character, with Wilfred being the one who mostly antagonizes Bartholomew. However, after World War II, Dr. Seuss was inspired by his mockery of Hitler to portray unelected leaders as irrational tyrants. The king not only acts irrationally, but like a bride child as he growls at the sky for having the same 4 things come down. When winter comes, he complains to Bartholomew that the things that come down from my sky and that I want something new to come down. He explicitly calls the sky his in his display of hubris and ignores Bartholomew's warnings about creating something new in the sky, playing with something he can't control. Like Harriet with the matches, Derwin is initially mesmerized by the beautiful Ooblecks that he thinks will put him above all other kings. However, near the end of the book, the proud and mighty Derwin is instead left trapped in the Oobleck on his throne, trembling, shaking, helpless as a baby. Despite this, he still refuses to apologize because kings never say, "I'm sorry." And I am the mightiest king of all the world. Just as Harriet's desire to be an adult led to her never becoming an adult, the king's arrogance leads him to become a helpless child with no one able or willing to help him instead of a mighty king. He, as well as the king of Did, are only saved when he swallows his pride and sobs like a child in remorse as he tells Bartholomew, "I'm awfully, awfully sorry." By acting like a remorseful child, the king saves himself from the fate of the 9 children in Strule here. Just as the king is the 9 child figure while being an adult in authority, Bartholomew is the adult figure while still being a child with no authority. Like the authority figures in Strule here, Bartholomew's warnings go unheeded by the stubborn, prideful king. However, unlike the authority figures in Strule here, who have authority over their charges, Bartholomew lacks any authority to fight the adults, king or the adults around him. He warns the king not to call the magicians, but when he's commanded to summon the magicians with a whistle, all he can do is obey before he warns the king, "I still think that you will be very sorry." Instead of his commands being ignored, Bartholomew is forced to take part in the king's foolish plan. It's not until he and the bell ringer discover the dangerous nature of the oobleck that Bartholomew fights the king. Instead of ordering the people of Did to play in the oobleck, he seeks an adult to help him warn the people. However, in a subversion of the cautionary verse where good behavior is a form of self-preservation, the adults are all trapped in the oobleck and unable to help him despite his obedience to authority. With no adult to help him, Bartholomew is forced to become the adult, telling the king to his face that if he doesn't apologize for causing the oobleck disaster, "You're no sort of king at all," before preparing to storm out the room. This rebuke finally makes the king weep in shame as he apologizes, which makes the oobleck disappear. By breaking the rules of the cautionary verse and taking on the authority of the adult, Bartholomew saves the kingdom of Did. While the book teaches readers to take responsibility for their actions, they also learn another important lesson. Sometimes it is necessary to defy and resist authority, even from trusted adults, in order to keep themselves and others safe. While the cautionary tales verse and verse genre of children's books encourage children to rely on adults for safety, more modern picture books encourage children to gain independence and learn how to face their problems. And this is just my works cited. Thank you. All right.
And then we'll do questions after everybody's presented. So
Oh,
you
okay.
can have a seat.
Want me to share my screen, or are you going to share slides?
I was just gonna
Yeah, you can
show up there. Cheyenne, you can hear everything, right? Perfect. Okay. Because I'm pretty sure, yeah, I already got them pulled up here. So. Yeah.
Awesome.
I'll keep track of time for you.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Go ahead and stop my timer on this. Okay. So guys, I'm Jennifer Byrd, and I'm going to be talking to you guys about learning and fear, mostly from a teacher's perspective. So first of all, a little bit of background. I was a high school English teacher for 20 years. And for the first part of my career, I was able to rely a lot on my natural tendency to plan far ahead and to be a very type A personality and to try to control situations in the classroom as much as possible. But then COVID hit, and I had a situation that was not unique, but was interesting for my school. We were a hybrid school for about a year, and I had about a third of my class at home watching virtually while I would teach a lesson, and then about 2/3 of my class in person. So I felt like I was kind of pulling double duty there, trying to teach 2 groups of students at the same time. And then one day, not very far into this experience, we had issues with Zoom recordings while we were doing this because all of the teachers in our school were holding Zoom sessions at the same time. And our school's internet was not powerful enough to handle all of those streamings at the same time. And so the connection would frequently drop. What I did not realize until one day, I was about 20 minutes into my lesson, and my students alerted me to the fact that there was wild waving coming from my Zoom screen, and all of my virtual students were trying to get my attention. I hadn't realized until that moment that every time our internet connection would drop, I was muted. And I had failed to properly set my settings on the Zoom recording so that they could hear me whenever I rejoined a Zoom session. So I've been teaching for about 20 minutes and none of my virtual students could hear me. They were all wildly waving to get my attention. I was very embarrassed. If I had been a little bit more mature, and if I had developed enough of a growth mindset as a teacher by that point, I would have laughed at that experience and learned from that experience and reset my Zoom settings and moved on. Instead, I was mortified, and I had a very, very difficult time getting over that experience. But what that taught me was it was something that my students appreciated, that I could fail in front of the whole class, that I was a human being, that I could be vulnerable with them, and that I could learn how to get over that and move on and treat it as a growth experience instead of a mortifying, embarrassing teacher fail moment. So I did use that as a learning experience. And I started to share aspects of experimentation and failure and learning with my students. I taught primarily a high achieving group of kids, AP mostly, and some dual enrollment students when I taught high school. And a lot of times I was asking these kids to take academic risks in the classroom, but I was asking them to trust me without having earned that trust. So by taking academic risks in front of them and modeling how to experiment and fail, I was teaching them that I was willing to learn along with them. I became a co-learner with them in that process. And it made great strides in helping my students trust me and learn how to take academic risks themselves. So my thesis here is that teachers should model ways to take calculated academic risks in front of their students to encourage them to use failure as a means for growth and learning. Okay, so first of all, let me give you a little bit of research on fear. I showed this to several of my colleagues in the grad student department at the University of Memphis, and a lot of them had never seen this chart before, which kind of surprises me because it's pretty well known in business psychology. This actually comes from business psychology, but it is the idea that all human beings have a certain tolerance for risk, and they also need some psychological safety in order for that risk to produce learning. So you can see on the chart, there's a learning zone that comes when challenge is accompanied by psychological safety. However, if students or any humans don't feel safe, then if they're being challenged without safety, they develop anxiety. On the other hand, if students feel perfectly safe, but they're never being challenged, then they're comfortable, but they're not actually learning. So there's a balance here. We need to challenge our students, but we also need to give them the psychological safety so that learning can take place. There are several things that might prohibit students from taking academic risks. I have several studies that I'm going to bring in. This one is an author who mostly studied elementary students, but a lot of what he says applies to students of any grade level. He talks about what he calls a taxonomy of student avoidance behavior. So there are all different ways that students could respond to a fear of risk-taking or a fear of failure. Some of those responses include learned helplessness, where the students just, especially elementary students, but I've seen this in high school students as well, where they act like they just need the teacher to do it for them, or they need the teacher to show them what to do every single time, because they're afraid they're going to do it wrong. Then there's what he calls success avoidance, which I have seen a lot in high school students. In particular, I taught all different grade levels, but I mostly taught upper level students. But I would frequently have students in my on-level class who I was fully aware they should have been in upper level classes. Like, they were excellent students. They were very, very talented writers. And they would say, I don't want to take upper level classes because it'll mess up my GPA. And this was despite advice from guidance counselors telling them, if you have those honors level classes on your transcript, schools are going to be more likely to look at you as a candidate. They didn't care. They didn't want to mess up their GPA. And so that was this success avoidance that was coming out in them, where they refused to try to challenge themselves because they were afraid they would fail. Martin says fear and failure can underpin students' motivation to avoid success. So we see this in students, but it's not just students. This actually is present in all human beings. Another possible reaction to fear of failure is academic disengagement and anxiety. We saw on that chart a few minutes ago that when students don't feel psychologically safe, they may develop either apathy or anxiety. So that academic disengagement is the apathy. Especially when we're talking about students who are perfectionists. And I feel like I can speak to this a lot because I always tell people I am a recovering perfectionist. These students often feel like their identity is wrapped up in their achievement. And so for high achieving students, that usually means academic achievement. I am a plus student, or I am an AP student, or whatever that is, that defines who they are. The good news is teachers can help kind of reverse this thinking with careful discussion about it. When failure is normalized in the classroom, then teachers can kind of reverse this effect so that struggling with something doesn't change the student's self-identity. Okay, so we don't want the students to have an identity crisis when we ask them to struggle and fail. So we have to be careful about how we approach it. As I mentioned a minute ago, this is not just kids, though, that react this way. Adults react this way. I react this way. And a lot of teachers also have some of these same qualities. There were several studies that I looked at from across all different cultures that looked at how teachers react to pressure, or how they react to perfectionism. So one of the studies found that when faculty are afraid to change their teaching methods, part of it is because they don't have a growth mindset. They have this fixed mindset that thinks, I have a certain limit to my ability. If I don't know how to do something, I might be pushing that limit. And then if I fail, then, that's everybody finds out that I'm a fraud and I've reached the limit of my talent. Instead, we have to kind of reframe this mindset into a growth mindset so that both students and teachers realize that challenging themselves is an opportunity for growth. They're not reaching the limit of what they know how to do. They're learning how to do something else. They're learning how to do something different. So this really requires humility and vulnerability on the part of teachers. They need to be vulnerable with their students. One of the researchers, Zita Dooley, talks about creating this climate where teachers and students trust each other and they share their struggles. So teachers have to tell their students, hey, I'm a human being. I struggle with things too. Sometimes I fail. Sometimes I'm trying something new. Sometimes I will tell my students that they're my guinea pigs, that I'm trying something out on them and we're going to see how it goes. And if it fails, then we'll learn from it. But that requires some vulnerability. There was one study in particular that I loved that was looking at writing teachers. So those of us who are writing teachers can resonate with this. It was actually a faculty mentor and a new English teacher who are working together on this project. And they found that teachers who model risk can help students become flexible, confident writers. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how that study in particular did this. They created this situation where they scaffolded risk. So the teacher had noticed that her 10th grade English student, she was trying to get them to try out multimodal compositions, and they were gravitating to things that were familiar and comfortable to them. They were not wanting to try new modes or new ways of thinking. And so she started out by giving them a collaborative composition, working together. They could learn from each other, and they were a little bit more willing to risk things when they were working in a group. And then she continued with that experiment by having them look at low stakes assessments where they actually worked together on a rubric to discuss grading criteria. And when the students had some agency and some buy-in in how they were going to be evaluated, they were a lot more willing to take risks. So I thought that was a great idea to have students participate in the grading criteria. Then finally, they had a reflection at the end where the students talked about what they risked, how they learned something new, and maybe a point where they had a failure and how they could learn from that. So all of that helped create this, this scaffolded approach. The last thing that I would say, and this is partially in reaction to some of the things that we talked about last night at the big keynote address, is a lot of your ability as a teacher to take risks in your classroom is going to depend on the support that you have from your institution. So how does your institution feel about taking risks? How does your institution support you? In what ways does your institution give you the freedom to do some things like try out different grading criteria or try out ways to get the students to participate in creating a new grading criteria? You have to have support from your institution to feel that psychological safety yourself to take those risks. Last thing is, growth doesn't happen in the absence of fear, but in how we respond to it. So I encourage you to try something that scares you. I'm speaking at my first conference today, so I'm trying something that scares me, and it went well. So guess what? I'll try it again, but also I learned some things about things to cut out of my presentation next time so I don't go too long. Thank you very much.
Good job. All right. Thank you, Jennifer. Give me a second here to get our next presenter ready. We'll go from there. All right, Cheyenne, can you say something?
Can you all hear me?
Yeah, I don't hear you yet, so give me a second.
Sweet.
Cheyenne, keep talking like you're testing a
Yeah,
microphone.
absolutely. I can absolutely keep talking. Let me know as soon as you guys hear me so I know what the
Well,
vibes
that's
are.
good.
Any audio yet? How we doing? Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3.
That might work.
Testing, testing.
There we go.
Haha,
Oh,
perfect.
hello.
All right, cool. You are good to go. Let me actually There we go. That looks better.
Fantastic. And I'm going to go
Okay.
ahead and share some slides with you all. And hopefully this is working.
Yeah.
But let me know if no one can hear me at any point. This is my first time presenting virtually, so there's sure to be some hiccups, but we can learn from any failures. My presentation is Say It Well, Combating Engfish and AI's Artificial Engfish by Embracing Translingualism in the First Year Writing Classroom. Essayist Edward Abbey notes that what is the essence of the art of writing? Part 1, have something to say. Part 2, say it well. When taking Abby's words into consideration in the first year writing classroom, it seems to me that part 1 is easy. Students are ripe with ideas, with opinions, with things to say. Part 2 is where the difficulty comes from. How can they in writing both have something to say and say it well? As a first-time first-year writing instructor last semester, I did not have a breadth of knowledge or experience to pull from like many of my cohorts. What I did have, though, was what I'd seen during the semester, and most glaringly, I'd seen that a majority of my students did not enter the classroom enjoying writing. When I asked why, there was one common answer, that they're not very good at it. When asked to explain their reasoning, the answers always started the same way. Well, in high school, because of their high school hangups, convincing my students that a personal narrative, for example, could indeed be written in the first person was not easy. The academic and dry third person was all they'd been previously permitted. Much of the work in the first year writing classroom I've found is breaking the news to our students. They aren't in high school anymore. The anxiety of writing correctly in college is palpable. Students either employ the old adage that they can fake it till they make it as an academic by poorly mimicking the language they think professors demand, or worse, they run from the supposed demands. That's when AI and stench of inauthenticity rears its head. Good writing is the kind of writing that conveys the ideas of the writer in a way that is digestible for the intended audience. This can and many times should include elements of a student's translingualism, including their multilingualism, slang, vernacular, dialect, etc., because that is how they most effectively communicate. AI promises correct writing, not good writing, and students have been prioritizing the former when they should be focusing on developing their skills with the latter. It's our job then to offer our students another way to say it well. Every student walks into their first year writing classroom with a voice of their own, a translingual identity built by years of existing and communicating. Why not embrace that? Why push for correct when well said will do? Thus, I propose students' unique translingual identities should be encouraged and utilized in the first year writing classroom, rather than set aside in favor of correctness and the AI generative software that offers it when student attempts to mimic it and assimilate into academia fail. Because let's be honest, the attempts our students make at academic English are dry, colorless, without life. It is writing for the sake of words on a page, not for the sake of storytelling. Our students have been taught to be more concerned with the word count than with their word content. They write in the language of Engfish. Composition specialist Ken McCrory coined the term Engfish in his book Telling Writing as a name for the phony, pretentious language of schools. As McCrory notes in The Poison Fish, the chapter in which the term was introduced, Engfish is not simply bad writing, nor is it just academic facsimile. It is writing as lifeless as a dead fish. Engfish at its core is writing that does not say it well. And if Engfish is a dead fish, artificial Engfish was never a fish in the first place. Artificial Engfish both does not say it well and cannot be classified as writing. Writing is the verb to our student subject, after all. Speaking of students, in my own classroom, I had stated and restated the mantra of write like you speak more times than I can count. No matter how many times I said it, though, my students still approached such writing with apprehension, concern, and fear. They thought I was laying out some sort of elaborate trap. Write like you speak, so I can fail you. Insert maniacal laugh here. This preconceived notion, though, could not be further from the truth. I am a creative writer by trade. I want to read work with life, with teeth, with breath. I do not want to read Engfish or AI's worst attempt at mimicry. Even so, my students walked on eggshells when it came to getting creative or taking risks in their essays. Each unit had its own challenges in convincing my students to just say something and say it well. Unit 1, the learning narrative, required students to write about a time where they learned something, a vague, open-ended prompt that allowed my students to go wild and embrace creativity, or so I thought. As we spent the early weeks of the unit breaking down the pieces of an essay, the students were tasked with writing a discussion post on the role and purpose of a thesis statement. Easy points in the grade book, unless the student isn't the one doing the writing, that is. Student A, who had previously made his dislike of writing known to me and to the class, submitted as part of his discussion post this passage. Essays are a structured form of writing that requires a clear and a focused argument to guide the reader. The heart of this argument is the thesis statement, a crucial part of the paper that defines the purpose and direction of the essay. Understanding the role and qualities of a thesis statement is important for crafting a good and persuasive essay. This passage of textbook jargon, $10 word-filled Engfish caught my eye immediately. Student A did not write like this. He wrote well, don't get me wrong, but his previous in-class pen and paper writing did not sound like this. So I plugged it in to turn it in, as well as ZeroGPT, and got readings back that did not surprise me in the slightest. Both flagged at 100%. This was the exact definition of my proposed artificial Engfish, the kind of AI-generated slop, lacking in substance our students sometimes try to pass off as their own. So I called student A in for the requisite chat during my office hours, got the requisite admission of guilt or half guilt. He blamed his sister who completed the assignment for him, and filed the requisite paperwork. I told him that I wanted to read his writing, not AI's, not his sister's, but his. I wanted him to have something to say that was important enough for him to say it himself. He said he could do that, so I waited with bated breath. As I went in for the tackle, I started to break down, reading the ball carrier's feet. He made a cut and I followed, but when I made my cut, my foot slipped and instantly snagged onto the turf, causing my left knee to buckle inwards. I waved it off, thinking it was just a normal stinger. This is exactly what I requested. This was writing that breathed. Gone was his or his sister's fluency with the Engfish. Gone was the artificial Engfish. This was written by him. This was him having something to say and saying it well. Student A did not academicize his text, instead letting the words speak for themselves. I did not know what a stinger was upon entry, but I did on the way out. He wrote like a human being. In his discussion post sample, it was clear, regardless of the author, that he'd experienced the turmoil of academic writing, a student in Lorimer et al.'s article, Finding Complexity in Language Identity Surveys, stated so well. If you force too much on giving up your original language, you will lose that logic you will always still have as a human being. I had the skills and IQ to play the game, but I didn't care for my vessel. But if I didn't care for my vessel, I wouldn't be able to. I realized the importance of listening to my body. It was trying to tell me something all along, but I refused to listen. Student A wrote ironically. His experiences with sport and with writing, in my mind, were closely related. He had the skills and the IQ to write well, but couldn't listen to his writerly intuition for fear of not writing academically. He had set aside his language, his translingual identity, in favor of sounding correct, even if he didn't need to. Student A, when encouraged to do so, was able to use his own language to take something he had to say and say it well. By the time their second major assignment, the observation essay, rolled around, my students seemed to understand what I was looking for. Authenticity, voice, the ability to communicate an idea effectively, no matter the tone or manner in which you communicate it. These were all aspects of writing they were beginning to embrace. They had gotten used to rubrics with creativity as a category. My description of this assignment worried less about the academic tone assignment descriptions tend to take, and instead focused on conveying the task. Go somewhere new and tell me and your classmates about your experience. Tell us about the place you went and the people who were there. Tell us why you bothered going in the first place and why maybe we should bother too. This to my students made sense. They ran with it, coming up with interesting ideas and pitching communities as topics that got the light to return to their eyes. They were having fun while writing. 2 words many of them had walked into the classroom thinking would never be in the same sentence without the word not somewhere in there. Even still, I had students eyeing AI chatbots like they were an escape hatch. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I gave them an AI-generated sample essay. The essay generated by ChatGPT discussed our writer's experience observing a local soccer team. A passage my students latched to reads, "As practice began, I watched the team run drills. The coach called out commands, but players seemed more focused on chatting than the exercises. The drills involved simple passing and shooting, which were executed with varying levels of enthusiasm. The students of their own accord smelled the Engfish. They did not call out the use of AI, and I did not alert them of its presence, but they harped on the essay's lack of life. It doesn't say anything," one student noted. Another chimed in, "We didn't learn anything about this soccer team." And they were right. Had their assignments read anything like this one, I would have said the same things. By the time their 3rd major assignment, the analysis essay, had rolled around, I had hoped my students understood my stance on embracing their translingual identities in the classroom. My students, though, managed to prove me wrong. This, I am learning, is a fairly standard occurrence in the life of an educator. Student B, in her rough draft, analyzing the concept of anger, wrote, "I've experienced the motivational power of anger in situations where I was overlooked by others and needed to persist and overcome obstacles. Instead of giving in to negativity, I used my frustrations to prove myself and achieve my goals. This transformation turned what could have been a discouraging experience into empowerment and success." As McCrory would assert, beautiful Engfish. Engfish that was even flagged by Turnitin as AI generated, though I confirmed this was not the case through the document's metadata. The passage reveals very little about student B, tells very little of her story, and thus says very little about anger as an emotion. When questioned about her writing, student B stated in an email thread with me, she did not add a lot of emotion because she didn't want to overdo it. I held my tongue at the irony of fearing adding too much emotion to an essay about an emotion, and instead encouraged her to write like she speaks. She obliged. Student B wrote in the final draft of her analysis essay that in the case of her gaining her driver's license, many people would clown her or doubt her abilities because she was not known for having resources to get to practice, but she chose to use that anger as motivation. Her use of the colloquial "clown me" gets her anger across far better than her previous Engfishy attempt, and she actually told a bit of her story. Kept her tone academic though, engaging in code meshing. As defined by Prashant Ashanti Young, who practices what he preaches in his article, "Should Writers Use Their Own English?" Code meshing blends dialects, international languages, local idioms, chat room lingo, and the rhetorical styles of various ethnic and cultural groups in both formal and informal speech acts. And her choice to include the phrase "clown me" blends the formality of her writing and the supposed informality of her speech, making her writing more precise and descriptive with this inclusion rather of less than academic language. Young reminds us that code meshing be everywhere. It be used by all types of people. It allow writers and speakers to bridge multiple codes and modes of expression that are said to be disparate and unmixable. The metaphorical toolbox for language be expanding, baby. And I, for one, was so glad to see Student B's metaphorical toolbox expanding. My class's final major assignment, the reflection essay, asked them to reflect on their writing journey thus far. Where did they start and where were they ending? And my students sure had opinions on where they started. Student C, in his rough draft, wrote the following passage. "Bickers, praises, criticisms, and restriction are just a few of the many words I'd use to describe what my relationship with writing was like growing up. It felt like I was on an unpredictably bumpy roller coaster where 1 minute I'm getting applauded for using the right grammar, and the next I'm just getting ridiculed for misplacing some punctuation." He said it well. His writing, even if it doesn't speak on growth, demonstrates it. His use of simile and language here is a far cry from Engfish or what AI could produce. His writing, unlike a dead fish, breathes. Student D, in her discussion post meant to drum up inspiration for the reflection essay, wrote, "Considering English is my second language, I have never felt comfortable speaking. It has always been an even greater challenge sharing my thoughts with others on paper. Writing sounds like a simple task, however, my mind has always fought it. As I began this course, I feared having someone view my work." Student D walked into the first year writing classroom as so many of our students do, nervous, unconfident, and afraid. Her experience is not an uncommon one. Despite the college communication and composition special issue from nearly half a century ago, titularly asserting students' right to their own language, language is so often policed in the classroom. We academics expect flawless academic writing and instead bemoan the Engfish we're presented by students who have been taught no better, and who may very well be facing the difficulties student D described as a second language learner. Student D's experience reminds me and us of the importance of seeing our students as linguistically diverse human beings and teaching them as such. Engfish is the writing of faux academia. Artificial Engfish is the writing of faux human beings. In the first year writing classroom, we instructors welcome fresh-faced students new to the world of academia and lead them along the perilous journey of writing. Every student walks into the first year writing classroom with a voice of their own, a translingual identity built by years of existing and communicating. I have proposed that we embrace our students as human beings with translingual identities in order to steer them away from the production of the dreaded Engfish essay or the even worse artificial Engfish essay that presupposes our students' capabilities as lacking. Gone are the days of grammatical proficiency as the only metric to assess writing. Edward Abbey noted that writing is a two-part process. We acknowledge that our students are fully capable of having something to say. Now we just need to acknowledge that they are fully capable of saying it well, even if that does not mean saying it right. And then I just wanted to include my contact information if you had any questions or wanted to continue this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cheyenne. Natalie, if I can ask you to come sit up here, we're going to spend about the next 10 minutes. If people have questions for any three of our presenters, now's the time to ask them. Yeah, just address whoever you want to talk to.
Thank you for your presentation, Cheyenne. Something interesting that you said was your mantra is you should write how you speak, right?
Correct.
So it's
yeah.
it's kind of ironic that being from the Bahamas, a former British colony, I would say our mantra is just the opposite. Do not write how you speak, because we try to discourage, I guess, Bahamian students from using their dialect in essays, right? And I think part of the thinking is we want to equip students to be able to perform in the academic environment. And when we look at essays or texts that are produced for academia, there's still a certain standard that's maintained, right? So I guess my question is, how do we balance that idea of, using your own language, but still sort of meeting standards that still exist within the academic world?
Yeah, so when discussing first year writing, I'm thinking about students who are brand new to academia, who don't really know anything aside from the pushed notions of academic text, academic language, right? And so many of them focus on part two of Abby's quote, saying whatever their idea is in this academicized manner.
Right.
And oftentimes I've found that they forget that they have to first have an idea, something to say. So I think that the academicization of the text can come a little bit later. It is first instilling the confidence in our students that they have something academic to say that, to me, I have found matters a little bit more, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you for the question.
Question actually, BJ. So you mentioned, or you pulled from a source that I think you said was looking at fear. It was in middle school,
The Martin source, it was elementary.
elementary school, but then
Yeah.
you expand and say that
Right.
this is applicable to other grades.
Right.
Now, I'm curious, it seems like you were really hedging into your experience as a high school teacher, which
Yes.
makes perfect sense. I'm just curious if you have considered, and it's fine if not, the idea of bringing these lessons and this sort of vulnerable mindset to the college classroom, where, at least in my experience, and I'm curious in your experience if this is the same, we do have students that in their mind, frankly, due to the fiscal nature of college classes, there is the ability to be vulnerable and to fail in that time and space. They're there to learn the skills in a semester, get a job. And any vulnerability on the teacher's part may be seen as, why did I pay X amount of money for this class?
Yes, I actually have experimented with this semester. Cheyenne, can you hear me? I don't know if you heard the question. She asked about how this aspect of failing in class might apply with college students who are paying for a class and have a limited amount of time, don't feel like they can fail and experiment in that way. So in my first year composition class this semester, I actually tried a grading contract for the first time in my career. And that was that I didn't have time to go into it, so I'm glad you asked me. That was an experiment for me, so it was a little scary for me, but also it enabled my students to have a little bit more freedom to take risks and experiment without the pressure of it hurting their grade. And actually, in some ways, I rewarded them for the experimentation and it helped their grades. So one of the ways that this worked really nicely in my class is that as long as the students met a certain expectation in my class of, completing these assignments, meeting these minimum requirements, turning things in on time, attending class, they received a default grade of a B for the course. In order to potentially earn an A for the course, they had to do some extra labor things. And one of the extra labor things that they could do involved some risky revisions or some experimentation. And so, for example, I had one student do a risky revision. She's turning it in tomorrow, or not tomorrow, Monday. So I'll let you know how it goes, but I've seen drafts of it. She's doing a documentary for her risky revision instead of an essay. She wrote an essay for the first draft, but she's writing her argument about the significance of Vietnamese culture to Memphis Midtown neighborhoods and how gentrification has erased a lot of that culture from those Memphis Midtown neighborhoods. And she felt like she needed some images and some video presence to truly represent that Vietnamese culture. And she wasn't sure how to do it in writing. And so it freed her up to be able to do some things that she wouldn't normally be able to do in an English class. I think it made the composition that much better. And this is a very high achieving straight A student who had to get to a point where she really did trust me that this was something that would help her composition and not hurt it. But because she wants to explore film as a major, it also gave her a little bit of experience with that as well. So that worked out way better than I could have anticipated. And I think she would agree that the class was worth her money that she spent on it because she was able to have that freedom to experiment.
Question for Natalie. So I have a couple young kids and I noticed there are lots of different versions of sort of that, like there's something scary, different types, like there's a scary book and it's sort of like teaches you about how to face that fear, whether it's there's a monster thing in the book or one of these sort of things. I've noticed, and one of the things I noticed reading these books, and your examples are great at this, and I'm wondering if you notice it's the way you think, is that insofar as there's like a didactic element, like a lesson to be learned, it's not that you face fear through bravery, it's that fear gets disarmed through humor. Or fear gets disarmed through like playing and like I wonder if like what's the function of that?
Well, picture books themselves while they can be used to teach children, they can also be used to entertain children too. And with and with Go Away Big Green Monster, it's supposed to be sort of fun, like you're supposed to control the monster and show him who's boss. And Shrill Peter itself is you are meant to be a little scared of burning alive or having the big tall tailor cut your thumbs off. But you're also supposed to be, but not too scared. You're supposed to think it's sort of funny too. This Shrill Peter was actually originally made for 3 to 6 year olds. Henrik Hoffman actually originally wrote it in 1844 as a Christmas gift for his 3-year-old son. Yeah, but
Merry
Because-
Christmas. Cut your thumbs off.
and 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 of course, one good way to teach kids is to make it fun or funny. So I think that's possibly why it is. Like after all, and fear getting disarmed by humor is a good way to help kids face their fears. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have an important question about the other book. Have you made a book?
Yeah, I think I did when I was an elementary ed major as an undergraduate before I switched to interdisciplinary studies.
Because that will teach you a lesson, 100%.
Oh yeah, basically our professor had us make oobleck. I think it was cornstarch, vanilla, and like I forget the actual recipe for it, but it was pretty interesting. And I think for our experiments, it was a way of teaching science to us. We were going to a planet of oobleck, and we were seeing if the oobleck was solid or liquid, and it was liquid. Mm-hmm.
All right,
And
cool.
Punch it, that's all.
Thank you so much for being here for the first panel. We're gonna go ahead and break. There's 10 minutes until our next panel. It is gonna be all virtual, but it'll be in this room. So you're welcome to come back, go get a snack, use the restroom. But we'll be starting again here at about 9:45.